as a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned or shot with an arrow. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn, who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. See that you do not refuse him who speaks. For if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, how much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth? But now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I shake, not only the earth, but also heaven. Now this yet once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken, as of the things which are made, that things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. And as we've been studying through Hebrews, as we come out of chapter 11, we recall that chapter 11 starts back in chapter 10, where the author of Hebrews reminds us that the just, those who have been declared righteous, shall live by faith. The very faith that we come to Christ, come to God the Father through faith in Christ, where we are thereby declared righteous. That faith we shall live, the just shall live by that faith. Now that's kind of an abstract concept in the sense that that phrase alone doesn't really tell you to what extent, right? If he just left that phrase there, some of you might say, okay, I'm gonna live by faith, and then you're gonna draw a line somewhere. But you're not allowed to draw a line just anywhere. The Bible gives you tells you where you should draw that line. In other words, chapter 11 only makes sense when we understand that phrase, the just shall live by faith, because chapter 11, he gives us these saints of old who lived by their faith. And what we saw in chapter 11 is you saw a group who did great things by faith in their great God, but then you also saw those who suffered great things and endured by that very same faith. And so when we come into chapter 12, we're not starting a new thought. He's finishing off the thought that he started back in chapter 10. And last time we looked at verse 1 of chapter 12, we saw that the demands of faith, we looked at the demands of faith. And as we move into to verse 2 this morning, we're going to see the object of that faith. In other words, the author who was picking up that his readers were growing weary and running the race that God had set before them. Remember, the author of Hebrews wrote this epistle because there were real Jewish Christians who were threatening to apostatize and go back to Judaism. They were threatening to turn away from Christ and go back to Judaism because the pressures of persecution were real. So the author is encouraging them to run with endurance. And he gives these examples from the Old Testament in chapter 11. And this is not here for us just to say, well, that's a neat history. There's some real neat things God used to do. No, this is given to encourage us as well. In other words, this letter has been preserved for the church today. And so it's important that we not become faint. It's important that we do not become weary in this race. In other words, let me just say this. You know who never becomes weary in a race? Those who never enter the race. Compromising Christians, those who rationalize and justify a life of ease and comfort, they don't ever grow weary because they don't ever enter into the race. But for those who count the cost, for those who actually purpose to follow King Jesus, the captain of their salvation, the author is writing to you and saying, listen, it's easy to become weary, and he's going to help you with how we stop, how we refrain from becoming weary. Let me just say this before we get into all the details. If you ever become weary in the Christian race that God has set before you, and if you come close to wanting to turn away from Christ, don't forget this section. Always come back to it because God has preserved this section of Scripture for weary soldiers. Soldiers who fight in battles become weary. And so this section was given to soldiers. In fact, the whole epistle was written to encourage weary soldiers. Just go back to chapter 2, just to refresh your memory. In Hebrews 2:1, therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we heard, lest we drift away. Are you in danger of drifting away? Do you see a child that seems to be becoming weary? Then go back to the book of Hebrews, because when you look through Hebrews, what is it that Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, puts in front of these weary soldiers? These soldiers who are really threatening to turn away from Christ. He puts Christ. He puts the supremacy of Christ. Everything in this book is talking about how Christ is better than angels. Christ is superior to Moses. Christ's priesthood is superior to that of Levi. His covenant is a better covenant. He's a better mediator. Everything about Jesus is better. Everything about Jesus is more supreme. And so when we struggle, when we become weary, and we're threatening to turn away, we must come back. Or if we see a Christian brother, a Christian sister who's threatening to turn away, we need to come back and lay Jesus in front of them. Turn to Hebrews 3, look at verse 12. Beware, for there's a warning, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief, departing from the living God. What does the author actually tell us to do with folks that they appear to be turning away in unbelief? He says in verse 13, but exhort one another daily, while it's called today, lest any of you are hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. When we see brothers and sisters, it seems like maybe unbelief has taken over. A little sin has crept in. They become a little hardened to hearing the word. Well, what do we do? Well, in the Western church, we have this attitude, you leave me alone. You can't tell me what to do, right? That's the attitude of so many today. But the text of Scripture says, exhort one another daily. Now, here's the thing. Most churches are structured and set up such that it's kind of like a country club model. We pay our dues and we come in once a month, once a week, whatever it is, and that's it. But this is laying out a community of believers that actually are engaged in one another's lives, so much so that they can exhort one another. Here's the problem. If the only time I show up to you is to beat you over the head and say, look at what you're doing wrong, what's going to be the problem there? But if you see me coming along beside you and we're walking together on the narrow path and we're fighting the same battles and we're dealing with similar things, and then I see you struggling and I reach over to help you up, that's received much better than if you take me and standing on the sidelines and throwing rocks at you. The whole point of this text is we're in one another's lives. And it's not just a one-way street. You're encouraging me. You're making sure I'm not about to waver off the narrow path. You're encouraging me in my walk. You're exhorting me daily, encouraging me in what I do, in the battles I have to face. And then likewise, I reciprocate that. But it's not just the pastor congregants. It's also one another. And that only happens when you're engaged with one another. If you read the Scriptures and compare what is going on in the Western church today, they look totally different. And that's why the Western church is failing when there is no real persecution going on yet. But yet these churches survived and turned the world upside down because there's a real community there within the first century church. Look at verse 14. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. You're going to be encouraged as you read through the book of Hebrews to be steadfast, to persevere. Turn to chapter 4. Therefore, verse 1, since the promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. Look at verse 11. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. Drop down to verse 16. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. This book was given to weary soldiers, to those who are growing weary and running the race. You can read about this in chapter 6. Go to Hebrews 10, verse 23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Look at verse 36. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. What's the promise? For yet a little while, he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Remember, these Christians are being persecuted. And the writer of Hebrews is reminding them by quoting Old Testament prophets who said, look, you will be vindicated. God will come in. So who is persecuting them? What's the context of this? Well, the Jews were persecuting them. Did God vindicate those faithful Christians who were in Jerusalem who were being persecuted? Yeah, in 70 AD. You see, after 70 AD, we don't read about the Jews persecuting the bride of Christ anymore, do we? So he's saying, be patient. For yet a little while, he who is coming will come. He will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith. But if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but those who believe to the saving of the soul. So the author goes on, doesn't he? The author is concerned about these Christians because they're enduring so much, and he knows there's a temptation for them to become weary. And so he's encouraging them and teaching them how to persevere. Now come back to chapter 12. With that as an introduction, read these first two verses. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by a cloud, so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Well, the last time we noted that the life of faith, a life of obedience was likened to a race. In other words, the life of faith is anything but idle. It's anything but just sitting around. True living faith produces fruit, produces good works, and as we know, faith without works is dead, according to James. Now, even though the life of faith is living and active, the author has warned us about taking on activities that would weigh you down. I think we can all visualize. Take a marathon runner, for example. A marathon runner doesn't put much on himself, does it, to run? But let's just say he put a few ankle weights on there. Could he finish? Yeah, but he's probably not going to finish as well. Let's say you put a pound each on each ankle. Could he finish the race, the marathon? Probably. But is he going to finish where he normally would? No. Well, let's say he puts a backpack with 100 pounds of weight on it. He's probably not even going to finish the race, right? You see the visual, what the author's trying to get us to understand? Pink said it this way. Many professing Christians are engaged in multitudinous efforts which God never bidden them to undertake. That is like running round and round in a circle. To follow the appointed track means that our energies be directed by the precepts of the Holy Writ. And so we see an order, but there's an order here between the first verse in chapter 12 and the second verse. In other words, there's this negative. Don't do it this way. But when you come to verse 2, how are you going to finish the race well? You do it this way. So the negative precedes the positive. In other words, there must be a laying aside of these hindering weights before we can run the race that's been set before us. And the order is critical. And this order has been emphasized all throughout the scriptures, right? We've been looking at this in spiritual warfare for almost 2 years now. There must be a turning away from the world before there can be a real turning to Christ, right? You understand, before you repent, until you repent, you can't turn to Jesus. You can't turn to Jesus in faith and look to him until you stop looking at your sin. So you must deal with the negative aspect before you can go to the positive. And this is why repentance and faith always go together. We must deny self before Christ can be followed. There must be a putting off the old man before the new man can be put on. There has to be a denying of ungodliness and worldly lust before we can live soberly and righteously and godly in this present age. There has to be a cleansing of ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh before there can be any perfecting holiness in the fear of God. And the idea here is we must not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds so that we may prove what is right and what is good and acceptable in the perfect will of God, according to Paul in Romans 12. I want you to just think back to nature for a second, for example. Any of you who do any gardening or any of you who try to plant flowers or whatever, before beautiful flowers can ever flourish in a bed, the weeds have to first be uprooted, right? Otherwise, the labors of the gardener really are for nothing. And the Lord teaches us this principle, doesn't he, when he talks about his kingdom parables in Matthew 13. Wherever weeds and thorns are permitted to thrive, the seed of the kingdom will be choked out. You've seen this in your own Christian experience. You've seen other Christians, a person who would make a profession of faith. They seem to be excited. They even get baptized. But if they don't remove the filth from their life, if they don't turn away from sin, before they can never really turn to faith, and they're not going to see the peaceable fruits of righteousness that the author of Hebrews is going to talk about later on in chapter 12. I mean, what happened when they turn from faith? You've seen these people who seem to be so excited in their Christian walk, but then they turn away from the faith. What happened? Many times that they didn't break off, they didn't remove the weeds, they didn't break off relationships that needed to be broke off. They thought they were wiser than God. They thought that they could overcome the principle that bad company corrupts good character. I can remember when I first got saved, my friends were, I tried to manage that balance between being a Christian, didn't really know a whole lot, but tried to remain in those relationships. And it didn't take me long to realize I just couldn't. They were constantly pulling me away. They were constantly trying to get me to compromise in different areas. And there had to be this clean break. So if those things that fill our lives, those things that rule our hearts are deceitful, they're worldly, just understand the desire for spiritual things will be quenched. Our strength in the Lord will be zapped. Our lives will be fruitless because the garden of our souls are going to be filled with briars and thorns and weeds. And so verse 1 exhorts you to lay aside every weight. Matthew Henry comes to this and says, inordinate care for the present life and fondness for it is a dead weight for the soul that pulls it down when it should ascend upwards and pulls it back when it should be pressing forward. And as we discussed last time, the duty for us as Christians is to mortify those sins that weigh us down. We need to learn to abstain from fleshly lusts that wage against, war against the soul. And so in order for us to be successful in the race that has been laid before us, the runner must lighten his load to be swift and be able to finish the race. Pink said it this way: undue concerns over temporal affairs, inordinate affections for things of this life, the intemperate use of any material blessings, undue familiarity with the ungodly are weights which prevent progress in godliness. And he goes on to say, a bag of gold would be as great a handicap to a runner as a bag of lead. What do many Christians do today that you know? Maybe you're guilty of this. You're pursuing things. You're rich in things of this world, but poor in Christ. You forgot the admonition that Jesus gives to us. What profit a man if he gains the world but loses his soul? And we got to make sure we're not training our children to love the things of this world. Now, let's be careful. The Bible's not telling you that it's wrong to be blessed by God, but when God blesses you, what do you do with those blessings? How do you use the resources that God gives to you to advance His kingdom, to advance His cause? And so the author of Hebrews is encouraging us to lay aside every weight of sin. Notice the laying aside of every weight precedes, and the sin which does so easily besets us. And this has reference to the indwelling of the corruption of sin. As we read this section, we see that in order to prevent the sins that so easily beset us, we need to daily mortify sin. And we looked at that last week, but I didn't get to this. So let me just tackle this. Since we are new creations in Christ Jesus, why do we still sin? You ever thought about that? We'll turn to Romans 7. Romans 7. We'll just pick up the reading in verse 17. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that indwells in me. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, nothing good dwells, for to will is present with me. But how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do, but the evil I will to do, not to do, that I practice. Now if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. So what is he talking about? He's talking about our flesh is weak. Sin is still resident within the flesh. This means that we are inhibited and restrained from giving full and perfected expression of this new nature that Christ gives to us as new creations in Christ. Possessing the fullness of the divine nature without the corruption of our unredeemed flesh is a promise that will be realized once Christ gives us our glorified bodies. But let's make sure we're clear on a couple things here. The Bible's not teaching that we as believers have two separate natures. We only have one nature. The new nature is in Christ. The old self dies and the new self lives. They don't coexist. It's not a remaining old nature that's the problem. It's the remaining garment of sinful flesh that causes Christians to sin. The Christian is a single new person, a new creation in Christ, but it is the weakness of the flesh that prevents us from walking in a way perfectly the way Christ calls us to walk. One stated this way: it is a filthy coat of remaining humanness in which we, the new creation, dwells that continues to hinder and in this life. The believer as a total person is transformed, but not yet wholly perfect. He is residing sin, but no longer reigning sin. He is no longer the old man corrupted, but he is now the new man created in righteousness and holiness, awaiting full salvation. And so it's due to this weakness of our flesh, that sin remaining in our flesh, that we need to be killing sin daily within our lives. And you have certain appetites that your flesh wants, that you need to make sure you're not feeding those appetites. And so in our passage here, we see the heart of our sincerity as Christians is seen in the longing to be delivered from this indwelling sin. And that's measured by our willingness to lay aside every weight of sin. So let me go back to this example of the garden, right? Suppose me personally, have a great desire for a beautiful garden, and I go through much expense to plant lovely flowers. But if I'm too careless, if I'm too lazy to deal with the weeds within that garden, what good was my desire? Right? I may desire to want beautiful flowers, But if I'm not going to deal with the weeds, what good was my desire? All right. And that's the thought here. That's the thought of mortifying the flesh, mortifying sin daily. We must be willing to lay aside every weight of sin. All right. Now let's go back to Hebrews 12. This is where we left off last time. It's at this point that many Christians begin to despair because the power of sin seems to be too powerful, right? In other words, if you're looking to your own flesh, if you're looking to your own strength, then you're going to start despairing because you're say, I don't even understand how to start in my own strength to do what you just said. But this is where the author comes in with verse 2. The author almost anticipates that type of reaction. So what do we do? He tells you in verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. All right? So let's look at this in more detail. It's not the cloud of witnesses that's the object of our faith. Certainly the cloud of witnesses we looked at in chapter 11, they testify of faith. Their example is given to encourage us. But there's no power in the witnesses, right? No, our eye must not be fixed on the many. The author of Hebrews wants you to fix your eye on the one. And that's the point here, right? Now notice this. We see Jesus only, and from him we derive our true strength. In this verse, we see that Christ has the preeminence. He is placed not among the other racers, but as one who is the author and finisher of our faith. So he says in verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. And so notice here, the text presents Jesus as the supreme example for all racers. You see, Jesus is presented as the one who himself began and completed the whole course of faith. And so that makes him the one perfect example. Jesus is the one who teaches us how to run this difficult race that the author of Hebrews is talking about. Notice it was because of the joy that was set before him that he could steadily, trustfully run the race that God the Father set before him. The enduring of the cross was the most perfect example of faith in trusting God the Father. And as a result of his faithfulness in trusting his Father, he is now seated at the right hand of God as both the pattern and example of faith. And so this is why he can make the following promise. To him that overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, even as I overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. Revelation 3:21. Remember, Jesus is speaking to those persecuted churches. And for those who persevere, those who overcome, he says, I'll grant you to sit with me. Only the one who sits at the right hand of God the Father can make such a promise. Now here's another thing I want to point out here in verse 2. Some of your translations have this word, our faith, right? The word our is in italics. That means that's been supplied by the translators. But that word our is not necessarily necessary. The Greek word for author does not mean necessarily one who causes or originates, but rather he's the one who takes the lead. This means he's the leader. He's the chief. In other words, Jesus is the one who went in advance of those who are going to come and follow him. The Savior is here represented as the leader of the procession of those faithful servants who live by their faith. He is the pattern that we're to imitate. The life of Jesus lived here upon this earth was a life of faith. One of the commentators made this note. By faith he walked, looking always unto the Father, speaking and acting in filial dependence upon the Father, and in filial reception out of the Father's fullness. By faith he looked away from all discouragements, difficulties, and oppositions, committing his case to the Lord, who had sent him, to the Father, whose will he had come to fulfill. By faith he resisted and overcame all temptation, whether it was from Satan, or from the false messianic expectations of Israel, or from his own disciples. By faith he performed the signs and wonders in which the power of the love of God's salvation were symbolized. Before he raised Lazarus from the grave, he, in the energy of faith, thanked God who heard him always. And here we are taught the nature of all of his miracles. He trusted in God. He gave the command, have faith in God, and out of the fullness of his own experience. So what is the life of faith? If we're going to say Jesus is the leader of this faith, what is the life of faith that he's trying to teach us here? Well, first, number one, if you're taking notes, it is a life lived in complete dependence upon God. I mean, isn't that the basic, turn to Proverbs 3, isn't that the basic teaching of the different Proverbs that are given to us? Go to Proverbs 3. Proverbs 3. You're familiar with this Proverbs, but maybe you've not really thought much about it. Proverbs 3, look at verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. It says, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. And when you read through the Gospels, you see this is exactly how Jesus, that's how he lived his life. No one has perfectly cast themselves upon God and trusted God the way Jesus did. No one has ever completely yielded their will as the God-man did. In other words, whatever the Father told Jesus to do, he'd do. Whatever the Father told Jesus to say, he would say. Pink noted, so sure was he of God's love and care for him that he held fast to his trust and waited for him. I want you to think about it. Even when they were scourging Jesus, even when they hung him from the cross, he was trusting in the Father's will, wasn't he? Jesus is presented to us in the New Testament as wisdom personified. And wisdom follows God, not self. This particular proverb teaches me to stop trusting in self and learn to trust in God. We must learn to trust God just as Jesus did and not lean on our own understanding. This teaches me that I must learn the ways of God because when you think about it, my thinking, my decision-making capacities always have self at interest, don't they? If they're departed, if they're separate from the will of God, the wisdom of God. And so I need to be careful. For example, if God teaches me to be compassionate, I need to trust him. You know, the world looks at compassion and kindness as weakness, doesn't it? And your flesh may think that way. But if God tells you to be compassionate and kind, you need to learn to trust him. If God's will tells you, if God's wisdom says to love your enemies, then we need to trust him and not lean on your own understanding. You see, if I don't do this, then I'm going to dishonor God. When I trust God and lean not on my understanding, then I will show integrity in all my relationships, even to my own hurt. Now, that doesn't make sense, does it? That doesn't, you'd fail a business class here in the Western culture if you thought like that and you gave that answer on a test. But in God's economy, that's exactly what wisdom dictates. That's what trusting God says. I'm going to have integrity in my business dealings, even to my own hurt. What do you think about this false idea? You ever heard this? Follow your heart. What's the problem with that? Well, it can be very dangerous. We don't follow our heart. We trust God. We don't lean on our own understanding. And so if I'm not to trust in myself, then I need an outside revelation. I need a revelation from God about what I should trust, how I should live and conduct myself. So we have this warning given to us to avoid all self-deception, all self-confidence, all intellectual pride. In order for us to do that, we need to study God's word, right? You need to study God's word, and you need to be asking yourself, as I study God's word, how do I apply these principles in my life, my day-in life? All the problems I've ever gotten into were a result of me trusting in myself and not God's will. As parents, those of you who are training your children, those of you who are homeschooling your children, are you training them to think thoughts after God? Are you training them to have this dependence upon God's wisdom? And here's the thing. You know how you're trusting in self? You know how you know whether you're trusting in self or trusting in God? When you actually know God's will. If you're ignorant of God's will, you will by default be trusting in your own self, your own wisdom, your own understanding. This is why Jesus rebukes Satan. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So as you are training your children, parents, what part of God's will are you leaving out? What areas do you not know that you can't pass and train them with? Any area of God's word that you're ignorant of, and you pass that ignorance on to your children, you are training them there at that moment to trust in themselves and lean on their own understanding. As you put these principles into practice, you're going to learn, as Christ did, that God's ways are always the best. One of the greatest temptations you and I will ever face is to trust in self. But that's the exact opposite of what this text teaches us. Resist the temptation to put your will. Resist the temptation to put your desires above God's word. Resist the temptation to be spiritually lazy where you have no idea what God wants. And so you're forced to lean on your own understanding. You see, Proverbs condemns us if we trust in self. The example of Jesus, his life, condemns us if we don't trust the Father, because his example was to always trust the Father. And so this proverb teaches us to trust in God in all areas of our life. God must dominate every area of our life. Notice we're to trust in the Lord with all our heart. This means he must dominate us. Nothing is excluded from the godly domination of God within our lives. I mean, look at verse 6. In all your ways, acknowledge him. In all your ways, acknowledge him. And he should direct your paths. We must learn to acknowledge God in all of our ways. You must allow God to consume all areas of your life. All your thinking, your planning, all your reasoning must be dominated by his word. So what is this life of faith? A life of faith trusts God, number one. Two, a life of faith is a life that is lived in communion with God. No one has ever lived with such constant and deep communion with the divine presence as Jesus did. As you read through the Gospels, you see that from Bethlehem to Calvary, he enjoyed unbroken fellowship with the Father. I mean, even after 3 hours of darkness, the Son still cries out, Father, it is in your hands I commend my spirit. You think about the darkest point in history, the Son of God still trusted his Father. Are any of you, is this hitting you the way it does me when I think about the example Jesus gives to us and how much more we have to grow? And once again, these things are not given to you to discourage you. They're given to you to encourage you, just like the author of Hebrews is doing, to look to Christ, the author and perfecter of your faith. Number three, a life of faith is lived in obedience to God. In other words, the object of our faith is Christ. And if he is indeed our object, then we should delight in pleasing him. Faith not only trusts and respects the promises of God, but faith trusts and respects the laws of God, the commands of God given to us. Faith not only trusts God for the future, but our faith trusts God now in the present. I mean, this is how Jesus lived. You remember what Jesus said in John 8, I always do the things which please him. I mean, and this even included when he was a child. You remember in Luke 2:49 when he was a child, and they're asking his parents, what were you doing? And what did he tell them? I must be about my Father's business. That's how one who is governed by faith lives. This characterized his entire life. In order that the scriptures may be fulfilled, Jesus had to live by every word of God. And this is why he could say without any qualifications, any hesitation, he says, I have kept my Father's commandments in John 15:10. Fourth, a life of faith is a life assured confidence in the unseen future. In other words, faith is looking from things here in time and space. It has this idea of I'm going to rise above my own circumstance and look to the future promise, the future glory that Christ has for me. If you recall, we studied in Hebrews 11, we know that faith is the substance of things hoped for, evidence of the things not yet seen. And so that enables the possessor of faith to live now in the power and the enjoyment of that which is to come. And that's how Jesus, this is how for the joy set before him, this is how he endured the cross. It's by faith. I mean, you think about this. Jesus on his way to the cross in John 16. By faith, Jesus could say, I have overcome the world. This is before he did it. He was looking to the promise that God the Father had given to him. I want you to think about this. Christ was so assured by the promises of God that he would inherit. Remember in Psalm 2, the Father looks to the Son and says, ask of me of the nations, I'll give them to you as an inheritance. What is it that Satan tries to tempt Jesus with there in the wilderness? If you'll just worship me, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world. And what did Jesus look to him and say? I'm not going to gain the kingdoms of the world through disobedience. I'm going to gain the kingdoms of the world. The Father's going to give them to me through my obedience. It'll be my inheritance. The nations are going to be mine, but I'm going to gain the nations through obeying the Father by going to the cross. Go back to Hebrews 12. Hebrews 12. Verse 2. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And so when I look at this text, I'm understanding I'm to look to Jesus, the author. In other words, he's the leader. He's the captain. I'm to follow him. He's the finisher. When you think of that word finisher, I want you to think the perfecter of faith. Jesus is the first and last great example of true obedience. He's the great example of faith. He's the most complete model of faith. He's the most complete model of obedience that the author of Hebrews could tell you to fix your eyes and gaze your eyes upon. Notice, Jesus is not included with the heroes of faith back in chapter 11. Jesus is distinguished from them. Jesus is above them. In other words, who in chapter 11 could you compare to Jesus? This is why he's the author. This is why he's the finisher. This is why he's the captain. This is why he's the perfecter of faith. This is why it's so important for us to study his life within the Gospels. You know, the gospel's not there just to teach you some neat things about Jesus, right? They're there to teach you how Jesus lived. Jesus is the supreme example of one who lived a life of faith and obedience to the Father. And so we're exhorted to look unto Jesus. Gaze your eyes, focus upon him. Now, how does he do this? You know, when it says he's a perfecter of our faith, how does he perfect our faith? Well, number one, he does this by the grace that he gives to us, right? Remember, we have this false view of grace as well out there, right? You know, when we say we're Grace Reformed Baptist Church, what are we saying? We're not saying we're the church that winks at sin, Reformed Baptist Church. The grace of God is the enabling power of God to help us live the life of God. And so his grace flows to us. You see, we need more than just a flawless model set before us. In other words, who here in your own strength can follow the example of Jesus? None of us could. Jesus not only came before us to give us the perfect example, but Jesus dwells within us and empowers us to live this life of faith. And so as we yield ourselves to him, call upon his enabling power, we're able to follow in his footsteps. And if you will examine your own life, the areas where you stumble, the areas where you fall, where the areas more than likely you are absent from the throne of grace. When was the last time you were there? When was the last time, if you're struggling in your walk today, the Lord is convicting you about some things in your life, then you're going to have to ask yourself, how long have you been a stranger from the throne of grace? And that might explain a lot of what you're struggling with. When you see a child who is struggling with sin, you know, a lot of times parents, you throw more rules at them. That only frustrates the flesh. And I'm not saying they don't need rules, but what I'm saying is that if all you give them, but you don't teach them how to go to the throne of grace, you're going to frustrate them because they'll never learn how to walk in a way. Or what they'll do is they'll become very legalistic by setting up an arbitrary standard that they can meet. And then they try to satisfy, I met the standard they set. You don't want them to become little legalists. What you want them to become is dependent upon the grace of Christ. You, as a parent, must be before the throne of grace so that your child sees you there at the throne of grace and then take them there with you. All right. Secondly, our great shepherd. How does Christ perfect our faith? Number two, our great shepherd leads us along the pathways of discipline. And this whole chapter is going to be, most of this chapter is going to be given to discipline. We'll deal with that later, but I just want you to think about it. This great shepherd, he wields the rod and staff, as we learned it when we studied Psalm 23. He wields the rod and staff for our discipline, for our protection. In other words, the disciplining nature of our shepherd draws our affections away from worldly desires. And what he does is he helps us fix our affections and our attention upon him. You think about it. Why do many times you have to go through afflictions and difficult times? Many times the difficulties you go through is just to get your attention and draw back close to him. And finally, Jesus perfects our faith by encouraging us to this final glory that he promises us. We're encouraged, we're strengthened by assurance that Jesus will return and Jesus will ultimately conform us into his image as he removes the effects of the curse of sin, not only from this earth, but as he gives us glorified bodies that no longer contain indwelling sin. And so just remember the theme of Hebrews. The author is writing to these Jewish Christians who are threatening to apostatize from faith due to persecution. So what does the author lay before them, right? What is it the author is doing to persuade these persecuted Christians to stay the course, not to become weary? He simply says, look to Jesus. You know, some of you who always might be looking for complicated strategies and ways to deal with sin, this may seem overly simplistic, but it is the only answer the Bible gives to us when you're struggling with the indwelling power of sin. When you become weary in running the race that God has given to you, it says, look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith. Jesus is the mark on which we set our eyes. Jesus is the one we are to focus upon if we're going to press forward. The thrust of this verse is that we're to be constantly looking to Jesus, habitually looking to Jesus. But how should we look? We should be looking with trust. We should be looking with submission. We should be looking with hope and with great expectation. So we look to him because he's the fountain of grace. Turn to Philippians 4 real quickly. Philippians 4, do you remember what Paul says? Philippians 4. In verse 19, and may God supply all your needs according to the riches in his glory by Christ Jesus. Well, since all the riches of glory are found in him, then we stay focused upon him. This means we're to seek the help that only can come from Him. And I think we need to remember this, right? If you need help changing your tire, I can help you. I can't break the reigning power of sin in your life, though. I can point you to the one who can. I can tell you what He has done in my life. But it is only Christ that you must look to, the riches of His glory. Only Christ can help us when we're going through temptation. And in order to overcome sin, we got to draw close to Him, draw near to Him. So, as we put these two verses together, just read it now. I'll try to bring this to a close, and we'll pick up here, Lord willing, next week. Turn back to Hebrews 12. Think about these two verses put together. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So what keeps you from running the race? Well, one commentator gave a list of hindrances. You have an active enemy. You have the active devil. You have an evil world that you live in. You have indwelling sin. You have mysterious trials. You have fierce opposition. You have affliction. All these things are hindrances to running this race that is set before us. And at times, these hindrances may even cause you to doubt the love of the Father. So when that happens, we need to call to remembrance the great cloud of witnesses, because they endured very same hindrances, very same obstacles that we do. They faced those obstacles, but yet they ran their race with patience and overcame. They won the victor's crown. So how did they do this? Same way you're going to do it. You're going to look to Jesus, the author and finisher of the faith. Now pay attention to this. In order to look to Jesus, you got to look away from your circumstance. Sometimes we struggle in the race because we're focused on how difficult the path is. I can't believe I've got this path, and this guy over here it looks like their path is so much easier. We're always focusing on the circumstance and the path. The author doesn't say that. The author says, look unto Jesus. Pay attention to this. Look away from your circumstance. Keep your focus upon Him. Don't focus on the obstacle. Place your gaze upon Jesus and ask Him how we're going to overcome this, how He can enable you to overcome the obstacle, the hindrance that's in your life. Another thing that we'll struggle with is if you start looking to self or looking to past accomplishments. The author doesn't tell you to do that, does he? He says, no, you keep your eyes focused on Him, who is the fullness of Godhead bodily, right? He is able to help you in your times of temptation. He's there to help you in your times of struggle. He is there to strengthen you when you're weak. He's there to guide you when you're perplexed and you're confused and you don't know what direction to go. He's just there to supply every need. Every need. I hope you're getting the point of this text. We need to have our minds, we need to have our affections focused upon Him always. And I don't know what the Lord has in store over the next decade or two, but unless there's a change, the direction of what's happening within our culture seems to be getting faster and faster. They're going to put more pressure on you to capitulate, to compromise, to turn from Christ. When that day comes, what are you going to do? I want you to remember this text. I want you to remember these studies in Hebrews to encourage you on your race. Anytime you become weary, right? That's one of the, if you haven't read Pilgrim's Progress in a while, go back and read it. Didn't Pilgrim have to go through so many different barriers? It wasn't Christ, the King, kind to send him help along the way. And that's what we do. That's the Pilgrim's journey. That's the Pilgrim's journey. Let me just deal with one more thing real quick. Notice the author shows us the attitude we're to have. The reason why the text doesn't say look to your pastor is because your pastor doesn't always have an attitude of joy with my path that God gives to me. He says look to Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him, he endured the shame of the cross. You're to look to his example. That's the attitude we should have. Jesus had joy while enduring everything he had to endure. Understand, no one has ever endured the level of hatred and hostility that Jesus endured. But yet the author teaches us Jesus faced it with joy. So turn over to John 15 real quick. Let me just read a couple things just to get you to think about this. Now, some of you, let's go back. Who does the world not hate? The world doesn't hate compromising Christians, right? So this is talking about those who are committed to their King. And notice the instructions. Jesus is there in the upper room. He's given this discourse. He's given some instructions to his disciples. And one of the things he reminds them of is this truth. Now, let me just say this. Your job's not to go out of here and provoke unnecessarily people, right? Being a jerk's not a spiritual gift. But if you bring the truth to our culture, that's all it takes for this reaction. Verse 18, John 15:18. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, remember the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know him who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would have no sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. He who hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works which no one else did, they would have no sin. But now they have seen and also hated both me and my Father. But this happened that the word might be fulfilled, which is written in their law. They hated me without a cause. But when the Helper comes, whom I shall send to you, the Father, the Spirit of truth, who proceeds from the Father, he will testify of me, and you will also bear witness, because you have been with me from the beginning. He says, these things I have spoken to you, that you should not be made to stumble. They will put you out of the synagogues. Yes, the time is coming that whoever kills you will think that he offers God service. And these things they will do to you, because they have not known the Father nor me. But these things I have told you, that when the time comes, you may remember that I told you of them. And these things I did say to you at the beginning, because I was with you. It says in verse 5, but now I go away to him who sent me. And none of you asked me, where are you going? But because I have said these things, you have sorrow has filled your heart. Nevertheless, I tell you the truth. It is to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go away, the Helper will not come to you. But if I depart, I will send him to you. Well, understand this. These people that are being written to in Hebrews, they experienced this. And Jesus is telling them how to deal with this. So the author is reminding them. See, Jesus is saying the world's going to hate you. Why? Well, because it hated him. And Jesus, the perfect, sinless Lamb of God, if they persecuted him, Jesus said, you rest assured they'll persecute you. The Bible not only teaches us about the persecution of Christ, it teaches us how he approached his persecution. If sinful men treated the sinless Son of God in such horrible ways, remember they slandered him, they mocked him, they even said, this man is of the devil. They scourged him, they crucified him. Then if they treated him that way, it should not surprise us when they treat us the same way when we press his claims within our culture. And so when we are mistreated for Christ's sake, how do we respond? Joy. Right? That's what it says. I know that sounds crazy to you. And we've looked at this in Acts before, but isn't this exactly how the apostles in the book of Acts responded to being arrested? Right? Remember when they were arrested, beaten in the synagogue, they left rejoicing. How did Paul respond when he got thrown into prison there in Philippi, in the Philippian jail? Was he sitting there, oh me, oh my, wringing his hands? He sat there saying praises to God. Well, we have these examples given to us, right? I know it sounds crazy, but that's exactly how they responded. The Bible teaches us how to respond to the hatred shown to us by the world. Well, let me just try to bring this to close real quick. There's a lot here with these verses when you put them together, right? And the more we're looking unto Jesus, the easier it's going to be to lay aside every weight that would hinder you from running the race. And I think it's at this point many fail. As Christians, we're able to deny all kinds of things when our motives are focused upon him and following his example. As we become more dependent upon Jesus, less self-dependent, the less self-righteous we become, right? The easier it is to lay aside those weights that hinder us as we keep our eyes focused upon him. One writer said it's something, think about it this way. One of the ways I think we should get our children to drop bad habits or bad influences is to show them something better, right? Isn't that what the author is doing here? I want you to lay aside these weights of sin by looking to something better. One said it this way: the best way to make a tired horse move more quickly is not to whip him, but to turn his head home. And the point I'm trying to make here is the more we consume ourselves with the sacrificial of love of Christ for us, the more motivated we are to drop those things that displease him. Furthermore, the more we focus on the beauty, the grandeur of Christ, the more we're going to desire him, the more we're going to desire to be with him, which he is our great reward. As we look to the great banquet that he has waiting for us, what awaits for the bride of Christ? It's the wedding feast of the Lamb. And each Sunday we get a taste of that as we celebrate and worship Him. Furthermore, He says that we will have these glorified bodies that will be compatible to the new earth, the new heavens and new earth where righteousness dwells. Do you long for that? Do you hunger and thirst for righteousness? Because that's what eternity is going to be. It's going to be in the presence of the Holy One, the righteous one. And this is the key. The more we focus on the joy set before us, the more strength, the more motivation we're going to have to run the race that is set before us, and we run it with patience. So may God grant us the grace to run this race. May God grant us the grace to see the things that are weighing us down, that are keeping us from running this race. May God grant us the grace here this morning to keep our eyes focused on the object of our faith, who is the author and perfecter of our faith, in who Him alone we keep our focus. Our Father and our God, we come before you. We thank you that you have taught us a more better way, a more acceptable way. We thank you that you didn't leave us to ourselves to figure these things out on our own, but Lord, you've given us your word, your sure word. You have given us your Son, Jesus Christ. Lord, we thank you. He is the captain, the leader, and perfecter of our faith. Help us to look upon Him. Lord, if there's any areas of our life that need to be dealt with, there's any weight of sin hindering us from running the race well, Lord, may your Spirit do His great work of sanctification today. Purge those things out. Help us see Christ in all of His beauty and splendor. And may we look to Him as our great joy, our great prize, our great reward that awaits for us. Lord, we long for the day. This is why the Apostle Paul would say, "Oh, Lord, come quickly." Lord, we desire the day where we spend eternity with Him. Lord, may all we do on this day of days, the day that the Lord was raised from the dead, Lord, may the bride of Christ just desire to spend time with the groom today and relish in His presence, the fact that we get to come before Him. It may not be said of anyone here that we're strangers from the throne of grace, that we might walk in the strength and power that He has to give to us. Oh, Father, we thank you for the Lord Jesus Christ, who has set a perfect example for us to follow and who enables us to walk in a way that is pleasing to Him. Lord, we give Him all praise and honor and glory for all these things that you are working within our lives. And we thank you for Him. It's in His name we pray. Amen.